When Admiral Thomas Kirkland stopped mid-stride during the routine morning inspection at Naval Station Great Lakes, his face went ashen white as he stared at recruit Cassidy Blake's hands. Those weren't ordinary scars marring her skin from fingertips to wrists. They were the unmistakable signature of superheated metal and electrical arcing, the kind of burns you only got from touching a live weapons console in a burning ship. He had seen those exact patterns once before, 5 years ago, in classified medical photographs from the USS Fitzgerald disaster. The civilian hero from that incident had vanished into obscurity, refusing all recognition. Now she stood before him in basic training uniform, being tormented by recruits who had absolutely no idea they were bullying a legend who had saved 340 lives with her bare hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In November, wind cut across the grinder, like a blade fresh off Lake Michigan, carrying with it the smell of diesel fuel and the distant sound of another division running cadence. The parade ground stretched out in stark geometric precision, a vast expanse of black asphalt bordered by buildings that had witnessed 70 years of young Americans transforming into sailors. On this particular Thursday, Division 352 stood in formation. 93 recruits arranged in perfect rows, their dress uniforms immaculate, their faces forward, their eyes trained on the middle distance in that peculiar military stare that looks at everything and nothing simultaneously. Petty Officer Vincent Crawford walked the line with the measured pace of a man who had found his small kingdom and ruled it with an iron fist wrapped in regulation. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself with the aggressive posture of someone perpetually ready for confrontation. His shoulders squared, his jaw set, his eyes constantly scanning for the slightest deviation from perfection that would justify his authority. Behind him, at a respectful 3 paces, walked Petty Officer First Class Ryan Hutchkins, his assistant, a quieter man who had learned that survival in Crawford's orbit meant agreeing with everything and questioning nothing. And Crawford stopped in front of Cassidy Blake, and the air around them seemed to crystallize with tension. She stood at attention in the second rank, her 5 feet 4 inches frame dwarfed by the tall recruits flanking her, her dress whites crisp and properly fitted, her combination cover sitting at the precise regulation angle on her dark brown hair pulled back in a tight bun. Everything about her presentation was correct, textbook perfect, except for one unavoidable detail. Her hands resting at her sides in the proper position were a road map of trauma. The scars began at her fingertips and traveled up past her wrists, disappearing under her sleeves. The tissue was modeled a patchwork of pale white and angry pink with a distinctive tight shiny quality of skin that had been burned, grafted, and healed imperfectly. In certain light, you could see the pattern, the specific lines where superheated metal had branded itself into her flesh, where electrical current had carved channels through skin and muscle and nerve. And Crawford leaned in close enough that only she could hear him, though his words were calculated to carry just far enough to reach the recruits nearest to them. His voice was a low growl tinge of contempt that he made no effort to disguise. "Blake," he said, letting her name hang in the cold air like an accusation. "I've been in the Navy for 14 years. I've seen a lot of things, but I have never in all my time seen hands like yours on someone who thought they could make it through basic training." He paused, letting his gaze travel deliberately from her face down to her hands and back up again. A visual inventory of inadequacy. Those look like you stuck them in a deep fryer and forgot to pull them out. How exactly do you plan to serve your country when you can barely grip a rifle without shaking? When you take twice as long as everyone else to tie a knot? When you're a liability to every person who might have to depend on you in a real situation? Cassidy's response was silence. Not the silence of someone who had been struck dumb by cruelty, but rather the silence of someone who had heard worse, endured worse, and learned that words were weapons that only worked if you allowed them to land. Her face remained perfectly neutral. Her eyes fixed on the point in space regulations demanded she stare at. Her breathing slow and controlled. She had perfected the stillness over 5 years of living with pain that never completely went away. Of waking up every morning and having convinced her damaged hands to work. Of existing in a body that bore the permanent evidence of a choice she had made in 3 seconds that had cost her everything and saved everyone. Crawford's words were gnats compared to the weight she carried. She simply stood there, a statue of calm in a sea of judgment, and waited for him to finish his performance. Behind Crawford, recruit Brandon Whitfield watched the exchange with a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Brandon was 22, but looked younger, blessed with the kind of easy good looks and casual confidence that came from never having wanted for anything in his life. His mother was Senator Margaret Whitfield. His father was a hedge fund manager, and his presence in the Navy was a result of a carefully calculated political decision designed to boost his eventual run for Congress with a veneer of military service. He stood in the front rank, his uniform custom-tailored in ways that were technically within regulations, but somehow looked more expensive than everyone else's, and he had quickly identified Cassidy as an acceptable target for the cruelty that simmered beneath his polished exterior. He leaned slightly toward recruit Marcus Delaney, his friend and fellow legacy recruit, and murmured just loud enough to be heard by the surrounding recruits. "I'd give her another week before she washes out. Probably cry her way to a medical discharge. Some people just aren't cut out for this." Marcus snickered, a sound he tried to disguise as a cough, but the damage was done. The comment rippled to the ranks like a stone thrown into still water, creating concentric circles of whispered judgment and sidelong glances. Several recruits shifted uncomfortably, caught between their own uncertainty about Cassidy and their unwillingness to openly align with Brandon's cruelty. Recruit Nicole Hartman, standing 3 rows back, felt her jaw tighten with anger. Nicole was 24, a single mother who had enlisted because the Navy offered stability and benefits she couldn't find anywhere else. And she had been Cassidy's bunkmate for 6 weeks. She had watched Cassidy wake up every morning at 4:30, an hour before Reveille, to go through a painful series of stretches and exercises designed to keep her damaged hands functional. She had seen Cassidy cry silently into her pillow on nights when the pain was too much. And she had witnessed the extraordinary determination it took for Cassidy to complete tasks that everyone else took for granted. Nicole wanted to say something to defend her friend, but speaking out of turn during inspection would bring Crawford's wrath down on both of them, and so she stood there fuming, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. And Crawford continued his inspection, moving past Cassidy with one final disgusted shake of his head, and the formation relaxed by the smallest increment. The way a held breath eases when the immediate danger passes, he worked his way down the line, finding smaller infractions to correct. A slightly crooked ribbon here, a microscopic spot of lint there, performing the ritual of dominance that was as much a part of basic training as learning to tie knots and fire weapons. The recruits endured it with the stoic patience of people who had learned that the fastest way through hell was to stop struggling and just let it burn. Behind the formation, standing in a small cluster near the administration building, the command staff observed the inspection with varying degrees of attention. Captain Rebecca Lawson stood with her arms crossed, her face an unreadable mask of professional composure, watching Crawford work with a detached assessment of a woman who had seen 1,000 inspections and knew that this particular drill instructor's methods, while harsh, were technically within the bounds of regulations. Beside her, Lieutenant Commander Paul Brennan made notes on a clipboard, tracking the inspection's progress with bureaucratic precision, and then Admiral Thomas Kirkland arrived. He had not been scheduled to observe this particular inspection. His presence at Naval Station Great Lakes was incidental, a brief stop during a larger tour of training facilities across the Great Lakes region, and he had decided on a whim to walk to one of the morning formations before his scheduled meetings began. He was 58 years old, a man who had spent 4 decades in the Navy and bore the evidence of that service in the gray at his temples, the weathered lines around his eyes, and the unconscious straightness of his posture that marked him as career military, even in civilian clothes. He wore his service dress blues with the 4 stars of a fleet admiral on his shoulder boards, and the ribbons on his chest told the story of a life lived in defense of others, conflict in the Persian Gulf and the Pacific, commendations for leadership and valor, and one small ribbon tucked among the others that few people would recognize as the Navy Unit Combination awarded to crew of the USS Fitzgerald for extraordinary heroism in the face of disaster. NH walked onto the grinder with the casual authority of a man who no longer needed to announce him. Captain Lawson spotted him immediately and moved to intercept, snapping to attention and rendering a salute that he returned with practiced ease. They spoke briefly, their voices too low to carry to the formation, And then Kirkland waved off the formal briefing she was attempting to provide, and instead began walking the line himself, moving slowly down the ranks of Division 352 with the unhurried gait of a man who actually cared about seeing the faces of the sailors who would form the next generation of the fleet. Crawford, realizing that a fleet admiral was now observing his inspection, unconsciously straightened his already rigid posture and modulated his voice to sound slightly less contemptuous. Aware that his small kingdom had suddenly acquired a much more powerful observer, new through the front rank. Nodding occasionally at recruits, his eyes taking in details with a practiced assessment of someone who had spent a lifetime evaluating sailors. He asked a few questions, his voice warm and conversational. Inquired about hometowns and reasons for enlisting, treating these nervous 20-year-olds like human beings rather than interchangeable parts in a military machine. He had always believed that leadership meant knowing the people you commanded, understanding that behind every uniform was a person with hopes and fears and stories worth hearing. He moved into the second rank, and that was when his life changed. He stopped in front of Cassidy Blake, intending to ask her the same polite questions he had asked the others, and his gaze dropped to her hands. For a moment, his brain refused to process what he was seeing. The pattern of the scars, the specific distribution of the burned tissue, the way the damage radiated from her palms. Outward, it was all horrifyingly familiar. He had spent 3 months staring at photographs just like this. Photographs that had been part of a classified investigation into the Fitzgerald incident. Images that had been burned into his memory because they represented both the worst moment of his career and the greatest act of heroism he had ever witnessed. NHI's hand, which had been moving to return a salute, froze halfway to his brow. His face, which had been warm and open, went pale, the color draining away as if someone had opened a tap and let his blood run out onto the cold asphalt. His mouth opened slightly, and for a fraction of a second, the mask of command slipped, revealing the raw shock and confusion and impossible hope underneath. He took a half step forward, his eyes locked on her hands, and then jerked his gaze up to her face, searching for confirmation, looking for some sign that his mind was not playing tricks on him, that the impossible was actually standing in front of him in recruit dress whites. Cassidy, for a part, had recognized him the moment he stepped onto the grinder. She had known this risk existed, had known that eventually someone might see her scars and make the connection. But she had hoped, desperately hoped, that she could remain anonymous long enough to complete basic training and disappear into the vastness of the fleet where one more junior sailor would be invisible. Now that hope evaporated like morning fog under the heat of his recognition. She saw the exact moment when he knew when the pieces clicked together in his mind, and she felt the careful walls she had built around her new life begin to crack. Empty silence stretched between them, a gulf of 5 years and 340 saved lives and 1 destroyed career. The formation continued around them, unaware that something profound had just occurred. But the handful of people close enough to see the Admiral's face registered that something was wrong. Captain Lawson took a step forward, concerned, and Lieutenant Andrew Kirkland, the Admiral's son, who served as a junior instructor of the base and who had been standing near the back of formation, moved closer, his brow furrowed with worry. Patricia Wolf's fingers hovered over her tablet. Uncertain whether this required intervention or documentation, Kirkland struggled to regain his composure, his training wearing with his shock. And when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper and laden with an emotion that was part disbelief and part something that might have been reverence. "Your hands," he said, and then stopped, unable to continue, the words piling up his throat, unspoken questions and impossible realizations, and 5 years of guilt and gratitude colliding into incoherence. And Cassidy's response was to look him directly in the eyes, a breach of protocol for a recruit, but one that conveyed a silent, desperate plea. Her expression was controlled, but in her eyes he saw fear. Not fear of him, but fear of exposure, of having the carefully constructed anonymity she had built ripped away. She gave the smallest, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a gesture so minute that anyone not watching closely would have missed it, but its meaning was clear. "Please don't. Not here. Not now." Kirkland understood. He had not survived 4 decades in the Navy by being oblivious to unspoken communication, and he recognized the look in her eyes, The same look he had seen in the eyes of operators returning from classified missions who needed time before they could talk about what they had endured. He drew in a slow breath, forcing his face back into something resembling professional neutrality, though his hands trembled slightly as he clasped them behind his back to hide the reaction. He nodded, a tiny acknowledgement of her plea, and then, with tremendous effort, he moved on, continuing down the line as if nothing had happened, though every step felt like walking through deep water, his mind spinning with the implications of what he had just discovered. And Crawford, oblivious to the silent exchange, completed his inspection with his usual mixture of criticism and condescension, and eventually the formation was dismissed. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So, if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The recruits broke ranks with the carefully controlled chaos of people trying to look disciplined while moving as quickly as regulations allowed, eager to escape the cold and Crawford's scrutiny. Cassidy moved with them, keeping her head down, trying to blend into the stream of bodies heading back toward the barracks. Nicole caught up with her, matching her pace, and leaned in close. "What was that about?" she asked, her voice low and urgent. "The Admiral looked like he'd seen a ghost when he looked at you." Cassidy shook her head, not trusting herself to speak, and Nicole, reading the tension in her friend's body, let it drop, though her eyes were filled with concern and questions. They walked together across the base, past the drill hall and the mess facility, and the rows of identical buildings that housed thousands of recruits in various stages of transformation from civilian to sailor. And with every step, Cassidy felt the weight of the past pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Admiral Kirkland did not go to his scheduled meetings. Instead, he returned to the temporary office that had been set aside for his use during his visit to Great Lakes, a small functional room in the quarter-deck administration building with a desk, a computer terminal, and a window that looked out over the parade grounds. Patricia Wolfe followed him, her expression carefully neutral, though she had worked for the Admiral long enough to know when something significant had occurred. He dismissed her with a gesture, asking for privacy, and she nodded and withdrew, closing the door behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet space. Kirkland sat down heavily in the chair, his mind racing, and pulled out his secure phone. He made a call to his aide back at his primary office in Washington, asking for access to classified files related to the Fitzgerald incident. And then he sat back and waited, his fingers drumming an unconscious rhythm on the desk, his eyes unfocused as he traveled back in time to a night 5 years ago when everything had gone wrong and one person had made it right. Entheus Fitzgerald had been conducting live fire exercises 90 miles off the coast of San Diego, a routine training operation designed to maintain combat ready. The crew was experienced. The weather was clear, and there was no reason to expect anything other than a successful exercise followed by a return to port. But at 2,200 hours, during the firing sequence for the ship's vertical launch system, something had gone catastrophically wrong. A missile had jammed in its launch tube, a mechanical failure so rare that the protocols for dealing with it were largely theoretical, and the heat from the missile's ignition had started a fire in the weapons bay that spread with terrifying speed. The automated suppression systems had failed, a cascade of bad luck and equipment malfunction that turned a manageable incident into a potential catastrophe. Within minutes, the fire was out of control, and the temperature in the weapons bay was climbing toward the threshold where the remaining missiles would cook off, triggering a detonation that would rip the ship in half and kill everyone aboard. And Captain Kirkland, as he was then, had ordered an immediate evacuation of the weapons bay and the surrounding compartments, and his crew had responded with the discipline and speed that came from endless drills. But the fire continued to spread in the manual override for the weapon system. The fail-safe that could vent the missiles and prevent detonation was located inside the burning compartment, accessible only through a ventilation shaft that was too small for any of his sailors to navigate while wearing firefighting gear. He had been faced with an impossible choice: evacuate the entire ship and hope they could get far enough away before the missiles detonated, or find a way to reach that override. And then Sarah Blake, as she had been known then, a civilian defense contractor who had been aboard as a technical consultant for the new weapon system, had appeared at his side in the Combat Information Center and told him she could fit through the shaft. She was small, she said, and she knew the system better than anyone because she had helped design it. He had refused. It was suicide. The temperature in that compartment was over 300 degrees and climbing. And even if she could reach the override, she would be burned badly, and there was no guarantee she would survive long enough to complete the task. She had looked at it with eyes that were calm and clear and said, 340 people, Captain. I can save 340 people. And then she had gone before he could stop her, disappearing into the smoke and fire with nothing but a wet towel wrapped around her face, and the knowledge that she was about to experience more pain than any human being should have to endure. She had reached the override. The technical report said it took her 47 seconds to navigate the shaft and another 32 seconds to manually operate the system with her bare hands, because gloves would have made it impossible to work the controls. 79 seconds in which her hands were in contact with metal heated to temperatures that liquefied skin and nerve tissue. 79 seconds during which she saved 340 lives. The missiles had vented safely. The fire had been contained, and the ship had survived. But Sarah Blake had not survived intact. They had pulled her out of that compartment unconscious and covered in burns. And the subsequent medical reports had detailed injuries, so severe that the doctors had initially recommended amputation of both hands. She had refused, enduring 32 surgeries over 18 months to save what functionality she could. And when the Navy had tried to give her the Navy Cross, when the Secretary of Defense himself had wanted to present her with a medal in a public ceremony, she had declined everything. She had checked herself out of the hospital against medical advice, refused all interviews, rejected all recognition, and disappeared. The last entry in her file, which Kirkland now stared on his computer screen, was a note from a Navy psychiatrist who had attempted to follow up with her 6 months after the incident and found that she had moved with no forwarding address and disconnected her phone. Diagnosis: severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Survivor's guilt: profound depressive episode. Prognosis: poor without intensive intervention. Status: unable to locate for follow-up care. And now she was here, not as a celebrated hero, not as a recipient of the nation's gratitude, but as a recruit enduring harassment from a petty tyrant who had no idea what she had sacrificed. Kirkland felt a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm him. A mixture of rage at Crawford, admiration for Cassett's courage, and shame that the Navy had failed her so completely. He sat in that office for 2 hours, reading and rereading her file, looking at the medical photographs that showed the progression of her injuries and her partial recovery. And by the time he finally stood up and walked a window, staring out at the parade ground where Division 352 was now conducting afternoon drill, he had made a decision. He would respect her desire for privacy, at least for now, but he would not allow her to be abused. He would not permit the woman who had saved his life to be destroyed by the very institution she had sacrificed everything to protect. He picked up his phone and made another call, this one to Captain Lawson. And when she arrived at his office 10 minutes later, he began to set in motion a series of events that would change everything. And Captain Rebecca Lawson had commanded Naval Station Great Lakes for 18 months. And in that time, she had learned to read the subtle gradations of authority that distinguish a routine request from an order disguised as a suggestion. When Admiral Kirkland asked her to join him in his temporary office, his voice carried a particular tone that indicated this was not optional. And when she entered the room and saw the classified files open on his computer screen and the expression on his face, she knew immediately that whatever was about to happen would require her complete attention and absolute discretion. The Admiral gestured for her to close the door and sit, which she did, maintaining the professional composure that had served her well throughout a career spent navigating the complex politics of institutional power. Kirkland did not waste time with pleasantries. He turned the computer screen toward her, so she could see the medical photographs displayed there. Images of hands so badly burned they barely looked human. And then he spoke in a voice that was carefully controlled but underscored with steel. That recruit in Division 352, Cassidy Blake, he said, letting the name hang in the air between them. 5 years ago, she was a civilian defense contractor named Sarah Blake. She saved my ship and my crew by manually disabling a weapon system malfunction, while the compartment she was in was on fire. Those injuries cost her everything. Her career, her health, her future. The Navy tried to honor her sacrifice, and she refused all recognition because she was traumatized beyond what most people could survive. She disappeared, and we lost track of her. Now she's enlisted here under her legal first name, trying to rebuild her life, and she's being subjected to systematic harassment by one of your drill instructors. He paused, letting his words settle, watching Lawson's face carefully for her reaction. I want to respect her privacy. She clearly doesn't want her past exposed, and I will honor that choice, but I will not stand by and watch her be abused. I need you to help me protect her, without revealing why she requires protection. Lawson absorbed this information with the careful deliberation of someone trained to process complex situations without visible reaction. Though internally she was recalibrating everything she thought she knew about the quiet recruit who had been flagged multiple times in Crawford's reports as a potential washout candidate. She had reviewed those reports, had seen Crawford's assessments that Blake was physically inadequate and emotionally fragile, and she had accepted a professional judgment because he was an experienced instructor with a solid record. Now she understood that his judgment was not just wrong, but dangerously prejudiced. And she felt a cold anger begin to crystallize in her chest at the realization that institutional bias had allowed genuine heroism to be mistaken for weakness. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes moving from the photographs on the screen to Kirkland's face. And when she spoke, her voice was measured, but carried an edge that suggested she took the situation very seriously indeed. Sir, I'll need you to understand the complexity of what you're asking, she said, choosing her words with surgical precision. If I intervene directly in Crawford's handling of Blake, without providing a justification, it will draw attention to her and potentially expose exactly what she's trying to hide. The rumor mill on this base moves faster than official communications. And if word gets out that a fleet admiral personally intervened on behalf of one recruit, everyone will want to know why. That said, I can implement changes to training protocols and oversight procedures that will have the effect of protecting her while appearing to be general policy improvements. I can also ensure that Crawford receives additional supervision during his interactions with all recruits, not just Blake, which will constrain his behavior without singling her out. And Kirkland nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in her approach and appreciating that she had immediately grasped both the tactical challenge and the ethical imperative. They spent the next 40 minutes developing a strategy that would thread the needle between protection and exposure, discussing ways to modify inspection procedures and increase command presence during training evolutions. And by the time Lawson left his office, she carried with her a new understanding of just how much courage could be hidden behind a quiet exterior and just how badly the system could fail the people it was meant to serve. She walked back across the base toward her own office with her mind already working through the implementation details, composing the memoranda she would need to write and the conversations she would need to have. And she felt a renewed sense of purpose in her role as commander, a reminder that sometimes the most important part of leadership was knowing when to shield people from a system that would crush them if given the chance. 3 buildings away, in the stark industrial confines of Building 1405, where Division 352 was housed, Cassidy Blake sat on the edge of her rack, which was the Navy's term for the narrow bunk that served as her bed, and tried to calm the panic that had been rising in her chest since the inspection ended. The barracks bay was temporarily empty, most of the division having gone to afternoon classes, and she had claimed illness to remain behind, needing time alone to process what had just happened. The Admiral had recognized her. After 5 years of successfully disappearing, of carefully constructing a new identity and a new life, someone had seen through her disguise in a single glance, and that someone was the man whose ship she had saved, the man who had tried so hard to force recognition upon her, when all she wanted was to be left alone with her pain and her guilt. She flexed her hands, a habitual gesture born from years of physical therapy, feeling the familiar tightness of scar tissue and the phantom sensation of nerves that no longer existed. And she wondered if she should simply leave, pack her few belongings, and walk away before the situation spiraled beyond her control. And beauty. Leaving would mean giving up, and giving up would mean that the last 5 years of suffering had been for nothing. She had enlisted in the Navy because she needed structure, needed purpose, needed something larger than herself to fill the void that had opened up inside her after the Fitzgerald incident. Her civilian life had collapsed with predictable inevitability. The defense contractor she worked for had initially kept her on payroll during her recovery, but after the third surgery and the 6 months of medical leave, they had quietly let her go with a generous severance package that felt more like hush money than gratitude. She had tried to find other work, but her hands were too damaged for the kind of precise engineering work she had done before, and the PTSD made it difficult to function in normal social environments. She had gone through her savings, then her severance, and started selling her possessions, and eventually she had found herself living in a studio apartment in a bad neighborhood, barely able to afford rent, jumping at every loud noise, and waking up screaming from nightmares in which she was perpetually burning. The decision to enlist had been born from desperation as much as idealism, a last attempt to find meaning in a life that had become unbearable. Empty door to the barracks opened with a metallic bang that made Cassidy flinch, and Nicole Hartman entered, her face flushed from the cold and her expression concerned. She had noticed when Cassidy failed to appear at the afternoon navigation class and had made an excuse to come back and check on her, navigating the complex hierarchy of permissions required for a recruit to deviate from the schedule. Nicole crossed the bay quickly, her boots echoing on the polished linoleum floor, and sat down on the rack next to Cassid's without asking permission. A small gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes about their friendship. Nicole was not someone who gave her trust easily. Life as a single mother had taught her to be suspicious of people's motives and careful with her emotional investments. But she had recognized in Cassidy a kindred spirit, someone who carried pain quietly and refused to use it as an excuse. And over the past 6 weeks, she had become fiercely protective of the smaller woman, who seemed to attract cruelty the way some people attracted luck. "You want to tell me what's really going on?" Nicole asked, her voice gentle but insistent. "Because I've seen you push through physical pain that would drop most people. And I've watched you handle Crawford's abuse without batting an eye. But today you look scared. Really scared. And that Admiral, he looked at you like he knew you, like seeing you was some kind of shock." Cassidy shook her head, unable to articulate the complexity of her situation. And Nicole respected the boundary, though her eyes remained worried. They sat together in silence for several minutes. The kind of comfortable quiet that exists between people who understand that sometimes presence matters more than words. And eventually, Cassid's breathing steadied, and some of the tension left her shoulders. Nicole reached out and gently took one of Cassid's scarred hands in her own, a gesture that most people avoided because the texture of the damaged skin made them uncomfortable, and she held it firmly, communicating through touch what words could not convey. "Whatever you're running from, I've got your back." Across the base in the Clinical Investigation Department of the Naval Station Great Lakes Medical Center, Dr. Stephen Garrett was experiencing his own moment of recognition and conflict. He was a burn specialist, one of the leading experts in reconstructive surgery for thermal injuries, and he had spent 15 years treating everyone from military personnel injured in combat to civilian accident victims, to firefighters who had sacrificed their bodies in the line of duty. He had seen thousands of burn patterns, could identify the source of an injury, whether chemical or electrical or thermal, with a glance, and he maintained a mental catalog of particularly unusual or severe cases that he used for teaching and research. That catalog included one set of injuries that had haunted him for 5 years. A civilian woman who had been brought to him at UC San Diego Medical Center after suffering catastrophic burns during a naval incident. Injuries so severe that the attending physicians had recommended amputation, and only his insistence that the hands could potentially be saved had prevented it. He had performed 7 of her 32 surgeries personally, had fought with insurance companies and military bureaucracy to ensure she received the best possible care, and he had watched her retreat further into herself with each procedure until she finally disappeared from follow-up care. Despite his desperate attempts to keep her in treatment, NH had transferred to Naval Station Great Lakes 2 years ago, and he had not thought about that patient in months until this afternoon, when he had been walking through the outpatient clinic and happened to glance through the window of an examination room, where a young the angle had been wrong for him to see the recruit's face. But he had seen her hands, and he had stopped cold in the middle of the hallway, his medical bag nearly slipping from his grasp. Those were Sarah Blake's hands. He would have recognized that specific pattern of scarring anywhere, the distinctive distribution of graft tissue, the particular way the burns had, tracked along the nerve pathways. He had stepped into the room without thinking, startling both the corpse man and the recruit. And when the young woman had looked up at him with eyes that were wide with alarm, he had known with absolute certainty that he was looking at his lost patient, the one who had haunted him because he had failed to save her from the psychological aftermath of her physical trauma. Empty corpse men had been conducting a routine health screening, checking for any medical issues that might require intervention during training, and Garrett had smoothly taken over the examination, keeping his voice professionally neutral while his mind raced. He had reviewed her current medical file, which listed her as Cassidy Blake and made no mention of her history, and he had conducted a thorough assessment of her hands, noting that the scarring had matured somewhat, but that she still had limited range of motion and likely experienced chronic pain. He had asked careful questions about her pain management, her functionality, whether she was experiencing any difficulties with the physical demands of training, and she had answered in monosyllables, her entire body radiating tension and her eyes pleading with him not to expose her. He had understood, had recognized the desperation of someone clinging to anonymity as their last defense against a world that had taken everything else. And he had completed the examination, marked her file as clear for full duty, and watched her leave with the corpse man, knowing that he now carried a secret that created profound ethical obligations. Medical ethics required him to maintain patient confidentiality. But those same ethics also obligated him to ensure his patients received appropriate care. And he knew beyond any doubt that Cassidy Blake was not receiving the psychiatric support she needed to manage her PTSD. He sat in his office for an hour after that encounter, staring at his computer screen, pulling up her old medical records from a UC San Diego system where they were archived under her previous name, comparing the psychological assessments from 5 years ago to the brief notations in her current file. The woman described in those old assessments had been in crisis, suffering from severe depression, anxiety, insomnia, and intrusive traumatic memories that interfere with her ability to function. The current file contained none of that history, just a clean bill of mental health from the standard recruiting psychological screening that was designed to catch major pathology, but could easily miss someone who had learned to hide their symptoms. He picked up his phone 3 times to call Commander Judith Caldwell, the base psychologist, and 3 times he put it down, wrestling with the conflict between his duty to protect his patient's privacy and his duty to protect her well-being. Evening formation found Division 352 assembled in the darkening twilight, the November cold having deepened into something that cut through uniforms and into bone. Vincent Crawford stood before them, conducting the daily personnel accountability drill with his usual mix of bureaucratic precision and casual intimidation, calling out names and waiting for the responses that confirmed everyone was present. When he reached Cass's name, he paused, letting the silence stretch for a beat longer than necessary, and then added in a voice that carried to the entire formation. "Blake, still here, I see. I honestly didn't think you'd last this long." Color me surprised. Not impressed. Mind you, just surprised. A ripple of nervous laughter ran through some of the recruits. The kind of laughter that comes from people who are relieved they are not the target and uncomfortable with their own relief. Brandon Whitfield's voice rose above the others, loud enough to be clearly heard. "Maybe she's tougher than she looks, Petty Officer Crawford. Or maybe she's just too stubborn to realize she's in over her head." And Crawford's eyes glinted with something that might have been amusement or might have been cruelty. The distinction was often impossible to determine with him, and he nodded slowly. "Well, Whitfield, I suppose time will tell. We've got battle stations coming up in a few weeks, and that tends to separate the wheat from the chaff. Let's see if Blake here can handle a little stress when things get real." He turned his attention back to the formation, continuing with the accountability drill, and Cassidy stood motionless, her face betraying nothing, though inside she felt a cold knot of dread forming in her stomach. Battle stations was a final test of basic training, a 24-hour gauntlet designed to simulate shipboard emergencies and combat conditions. And it would involve enclosed spaces, smoke, loud noises, all the triggers that her therapist back, when she still had a therapist, had identified as likely to provoke her PTSD. She had been dreading it since she learned about it in week 1. And now Crawford had essentially put a target on her back, ensuring that everyone would be watching to see if she failed. And after formation dismissed, as the division began the evening routine of heading to the Galley 4. Dinner. Cassidy found herself walking alongside recruit Megan Sinclair, a 26-year-old woman who had enlisted after spending 4 years working as a software engineer at a tech company that had laid her off during a restructuring. Megan was quiet, thoughtful, and possessed of an analytical mind that had quickly identified Cassidy as someone worth knowing, partly because she respected anyone who could endure Crawford's abuse without breaking, and partly because she had noticed that Cassidy understood technical systems in a way that suggested formal training far beyond what most recruits possessed. They had worked together during a shipboard damage control class the previous week, and Megan had been impressed by how quickly Cassidy had diagnosed a simulated electrical fire and identified the correct isolation procedures, working with damaged hands that clearly caused her pain, but completing the task faster than anyone else in the group. He's going to keep pushing you until something breaks, Megan said quietly as they walked, her breath visible in the cold air. Crawford, I've been watching him, and he's fixated on you in a way that's not normal. It's personal for him somehow, like he needs you to fail to prove something to himself. Cassidy nodded, unsurprised by the observation. She had recognized Crawford's particular brand of bullying early on, had identified him as someone who used his position of power to work through his own insecurities by breaking people he perceived as vulnerable. She had encountered men like him before in the defense contractor world, where competence in women was often viewed as a threat rather than an asset, and she had learned that the best defense was to be competent enough that their criticisms became obviously baseless. But that strategy required being able to perform at a level that her damaged hands sometimes made impossible, and she knew that battle stations would test her in ways that might finally expose her limitations. They entered the galley, a massive industrial space that could feed thousands of recruits in rotating shifts, and joined the cafeteria line, where Dorothy Fletcher presided over the serving stations with the benevolent authority of someone who understood that food was more than nutrition. It was comfort and routine, and one of the few pleasures available in the regimented life of basic training. Dorothy was 55, a widow whose husband David had been a chief petty officer killed in Afghanistan 8 years ago, and she had taken the civilian position at Naval Station Great Lakes because it kept her connected to the military community that had been her life for 30 years. She had learned to read the faces of recruits to identify the ones who were struggling, and she made it her personal mission to provide small moments of kindness that might make the difference between someone persevering and someone giving up. She noticed Cass's tired eyes and the tension in her shoulders. And when the young woman reached the front of the line, Dorothy served her an extra portion of mashed potatoes and added a dinner roll that was slightly warmer and softer than the others. Small gestures that communicated care without drawing attention. "You take care of yourself, honey," Dorothy said quietly, her voice pitched low enough that only Cassidy could hear. "I see you in here every day, and I see how hard you're working. Don't let them break you." Cassidy looked up, surprised by the kindness, and managed a small smile, the first genuine expression of warmth that had crossed her face all day. She took her tray and found a seat at one of the long tables where Nicole and Megan were already eating. And for a few minutes, she allowed herself to simply exist in the moment, to taste the food and feel the warmth of the galley and listen to the low murmur of conversation around her. These small moments of normalcy were precious islands of calm in a sea of stress, and she had learned to hold on to them tightly, because they were what kept her going when everything else felt impossible. At a table across the galley, Vincent Crawford sat with his assistant Ryan Hutchkins and several other instructors, and their conversation had turned to the topic of Division 352's upcoming battle stations evaluation. Crawford was holding forth with his usual confidence, explaining his assessment of which recruits would excel and which would fail. And when Hutchkins asked about Blake, Crawford leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression. "She won't make it through the confidence chamber," he said with certainty. "That's where we'll see her crack. The gas chamber breaks people who are already fragile, and she's been hanging on by a thread since day one. I give her 5 minutes inside before she's banging on the hatch, begging to get out. And once she does that, she's done. Medical DQ for psychological unsuitability, and we can finally move on without her dragging down the division's performance metrics." What Crawford did not know, what none of them knew, was that his assessment was about to be tested sooner than anyone expected. Captain Lawson had received Admiral Kirkland's recommendations and had decided to accelerate certain training evolution for Division 352 as part of her new oversight protocols. And the confidence chamber, the notorious gas chamber where recruits were exposed to CS gas to train them in the use of protective equipment and to build confidence in their gear, had been moved up on the schedule. It would happen tomorrow. And when Cassidy Blake learned this news during evening briefing, when she heard Petty Officer Crawford announce with barely concealed glee that they would be conducting confidence chamber training at 0800 the following morning, she felt the panic that had been simmering all day finally break through her carefully maintained control. Her hands started to shake, a tremor so severe that she had to clench them into fists to hide it, and her breathing became shallow and rapid, the first warning signs of a panic attack that she had learned to recognize but could not always prevent. Nicole noticed immediately and reached under the table to grip Cassidy's wrist, applying steady pressure that provided a physical anchor, and Megan, sitting on her other side, shifted slightly closer, creating a protective barrier with her body that shielded Cassidy from the view of most of the other recruits. Garrett Holmes, the 21-year-old former firefighter who sat directly behind them, also noticed, and his own memories of smoke in enclosed spaces and the panic that could overwhelm even trained professionals made him lean forward and whisper quietly, "Breathe slow. Count to 4 on the inhale. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. It's just training. They won't let anything actually hurt you." His words were meant to comfort, but they could not address the real source of Cassidy's fear, which was not the gas itself, but the memory of another enclosed space filled with smoke and heat, a memory that played on an endless loop in her mind, and that would be triggered the moment she stepped into that chamber. She had known this day would come, had tried to prepare herself mentally, but now that it was here, she felt utterly unprepared, and she wondered if Crawford was right, if this would finally be the thing that broke her beyond her ability to hide. Nth night, in the darkness of the barracks bay, where 93 recruits tried to sleep in their narrow racks while the wind howled outside and the building creaked and settled around them, Cassidy lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about tomorrow. But the harder she tried not to think about it, the more vividly the memories came, and eventually she gave up on sleep and simply endured the familiar parade of images and sensations that constituted her trauma. She remembered the heat, not just hot, but incomprehensibly hot. The kind of heat that made the air itself seem solid and hostile. She remembered the smoke, so thick she could not see her own hands, even when they were inches from her face. She remembered the sound of her own breathing, harsh and ragged to the wet towel she had wrapped around her face, and the way that sound had gradually been replaced by the sound of her own screaming as her hands made contact with the override panel. And the pain became so total and overwhelming that it eclipsed everything else, reducing her entire universe to a single point of unbearable sensation. She remembered finally the strange calm that had descended after the screaming stopped, a dissociative state where she had ceased to be a person and had become simply a function, a hand operating a lever, completing the task because the task was all that remained. And 2 racks over, Nicole lay awake as well, listening to the barely audible sound of Cassidy's breathing and recognizing the pattern of someone fighting their own mind. She had her own demons, her own reason for lying awake at night, memories of her ex-husband's violence and the desperate scramble to protect her daughter and build a better life. And she understood that sleep was not always a refuge, but sometimes a battleground. She considered getting up, going to Cassidy's rack, offering comfort, but she knew from experience that sometimes people needed to fight their battles alone. And so she simply stayed alert, ready to intervene if needed, a silent guardian in the darkness. And in the instructor's quarters in another building, Vincent Crawford slept deeply and dreamlessly, untroubled by conscience or empathy, already anticipating tomorrow's training with the satisfaction of a man who believed he was about to be proven right. The confidence chamber stood at the edge of the training complex like a concrete monument to institutional cruelty. A squat windowless building painted in the same industrial gray as every other structure on the base, but distinguished by the single heavy steel door that marked its entrance and the ventilation system on the roof that churned constantly, expelling the residual CS gas that permeated every surface inside. Division 352 formed up outside at 0745. 20 minutes before the scheduled start time because Crawford insisted on early arrivals as a test of discipline, and because he enjoyed watching recruits stand in the cold contemplating their upcoming ordeal. The temperature had dropped overnight to just above freezing, and a thin layer of frost covered the ground, crunching under boots as the division arranged itself in the familiar rows and columns that had become second nature after 8 weeks of training. Cassidy stood in her assigned position in the second rank, her gas mask held at the ready position against her chest, and she focused every ounce of her concentration on maintaining control over her breathing, over her body, over the panic that threatened to consume her if she allowed even the smallest crack in her mental defenses. Chief Petty Officer Douglas Ramsey arrived to oversee the training, a surprise that rippled through the assembled instructors because Ramsey rarely involved himself in routine evolutions, preferring to delegate such matters to junior staff while he focused on administrative responsibilities and mentoring relationship. But Captain Lawson had quietly asked him to observe this particular training session as part of her new oversight initiative. And Ramsey, who had spent 32 years in the Navy and had developed finely tuned instincts about when something required his personal attention, had agreed without asking for details. He was a large man, 6 feet 3 inches, and built like someone who had spent decades doing manual labor, with gray hair cropped close to the skull and a face that was weathered but kind, capable of both sternness and warmth, depending on what the situation required. He walked the line slowly, making eye contact with recruits, offering brief words of encouragement to those who looked particularly nervous. And when he reached Cassidy, he paused, noticing the unnatural rigidity of her posture and the way her knuckles had gone white where she gripped her gas mask. "First time is always the worst," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears only. "The gas is unpleasant, but it's not dangerous, and you'll be in and out in less than 5 minutes. The point isn't to torture you. The point is to teach you to trust your equipment and to function when you're uncomfortable. You can do uncomfortable. I can see that about you." His words were meant to reassure her, and on some level they did. But they could not address the fundamental problem, that this was not her first time in an enclosed space filled with smoke. And her previous experience had taught her that enclosed spaces could kill you, could burn you, could destroy everything you were and leave only charred remnants behind. She nodded to acknowledge his statement, not trusting her voice, and Ramsey moved on, though he made a mental note to keep his attention on Blake during the exercise, because something about her fear seemed qualitatively different from a normal nervousness that recruits displayed before this particular training. Crawford began his briefing, explaining the procedures they would follow once inside the chamber, the commands they would execute, the sequence of removing and replacing their masks that would demonstrate their proficiency with the equipment. His voice carried the board efficiency of someone who had given this exact speech hundreds of times. And he emphasized with particular relish the point that some recruits would panic, and that panic was grounds for recycling them to an earlier training division, or in extreme cases for administrative separation from the Navy. He looked directly at Cassidy when he said this, a pointed glance that was subtle enough to maintain deniability, but obvious enough that everyone near her noticed. Brandon Whitfield, standing 3 rows back, elbowed Marcus Delaney and murmured something that made them both snicker. And Crawford's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile before he continued with his briefing. The entire dynamic was a carefully orchestrated exercise in psychological pressure designed to increase anxiety and create an environment where failure became self-fulfilling prophecy. And Cassidy recognized it for what it was, but could do nothing to prevent its effect on her already fragile mental state. They entered the chamber in groups of 10, and Cassidy's group was the 4th, which meant she had to stand outside for 30 minutes watching other groups emerge from the building with streaming eyes and running noses, coughing and spitting their faces. Each group's visible distress ratcheted up her anxiety another increment, and by the time Crawford called her group forward, she felt as though her heart was trying to break through her rib cage, pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Nicole was in her group, as was Megan and Garrett Holmes, and they positioned themselves close to her without making it obvious, a protective formation that provided some small comfort. They put on their masks, checked the seals, and then Crawford opened the door and they filed into the chamber, entering a space that was approximately 20 foot square with concrete walls and a concrete floor and air so thick with CS gas that visibility dropped to almost nothing once the door closed behind them. Enfex gas was not visible as a distinct cloud, but rather as a general haze that turned the already dim lighting into something murky and submarine. And the moment Cassidy crossed the threshold into that space, her mind ceased to distance. She was simultaneously in the confidence chamber at Naval Station Great Lakes and in the weapons bay of the USS Fitzgerald, and the separation between these two realities became gossamer thin, threatening to tear completely. Her breathing accelerated despite her attempts to control it, and the sound of air rushing through her mask's filter became the sound of flames consuming oxygen, and the pressure of the mask against her face became the wet towel she had wrapped around her mouth 5 years ago. Crawford's voice, ordering them to form a line and stand at attention, came to her as if from a great distance, filtered through layers of memory and trauma, and she moved automatically, her body executing the commands while her mind struggled to maintain its tenuous grip on reality. Nth First Evolution was simple. March in place while maintaining the seal on their masks, a basic test of their ability to follow directions while exposed to the irritant. Cassidy marched, her legs moving in the required rhythm, and she focused on the physicality of the movement, using it as an anchor to keep herself present. The second evolution required them to recite their general orders, speaking loudly enough to be heard through their masks, demonstrating that they could communicate in contaminated environments. When Cassidy's turn came, she recited the words perfectly, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. And Crawford, who had been watching her with particular attention, hoping for signs of breakdown, found himself grudgingly impressed by her composure. The third evolution was the one that broke most recruits. The requirement to break the seal on their masks, remove them completely, hold them at their sides, and recite their full name and social security number before being allowed to replace the masks and exit the chamber. Crawford gave the command in Cassidy's hands, acting on trained instinct, moved to her mask and broke the seal. The moment the mask came away from her face, the CS gas attacked every exposed mucous membrane with vicious efficiency. Her eyes began to burn immediately, a sensation that was sharp and chemical and all-consuming, and tears poured down her face in streams. Her nose ran uncontrollably and her throat constricted, triggering a coughing fit that bent her double. But worse than the physical discomfort was the psychological trigger, the sensation of smoke filling her lungs. The memory of not being able to breathe, of feeling her body shut down from lack of oxygen while she worked the override panel with hands that were literally cooking. She heard herself making a sound, a low, keening noise that came from somewhere deep in her chest. And she felt her legs begin to buckle, felt her vision start to tunnel, felt the edges of consciousness beginning to fray. And then Garrett Holmes' voice cut through the chaos, calm and authoritative, speaking close enough to her ear that she could hear him despite the roaring in her head. "Stay with us, Blake. Right here, right now. This is just training. Count with me. 1, 2, 3, 4. He was counting the seconds until they would be allowed to replace their masks, giving her something concrete to focus on. And his voice carried the weight of someone who had been exactly where she was, who understood panic from the inside. Cassidy latched onto that voice, used it as a lifeline, and forced her body to straighten, forced her lungs to draw in breath despite the burning, forced her mouth to open and speak. Recruit Cassidy Blake, Social Security number 723. She recited the numbers, each digit a small victory over the panic that wanted to consume her. And when she finished, Crawford barked a command to replace masks. And she got hers back on with shaking hands, sucking in the filtered air like a drowning person breaking the surface. They exited the chamber 30 seconds later, stumbling out into the cold morning air that felt impossibly clean and sweet after the contaminated atmosphere inside. And Cassidy made it approximately 10 feet from the door before her legs gave out and she dropped to her. She ripped her mask off and vomited, her body purging itself in response to the chemical exposure and the adrenaline crash. And she remained there on her hands and knees, shaking violently, while her vision swam and her mind slowly, incrementally began to accept that she was outside, that the danger had passed, that she was alive. Nicole and Megan flanked her immediately, and Garrett positioned himself between her and the view of the other recruits, waiting for their turn, giving her what privacy he could in a situation that offered none. Douglas Ramsey approached concerned and dropped into a crouch. Beside her, his large hand settling gently on her shoulder. "Blake, "Look at me," he said, and waited until her eyes focused on his face. "You did it. You made it through. That was hard. Harder than it should have been for reasons I don't understand yet. But you did not quit. And you did not panic. You pushed through something that clearly terrified you. And that takes more courage than most people have. I want you to go to the medical station, get checked out, and make sure you're okay. That's not a punishment. That's taking care of your health. Understood?" Cassidy nodded, still unable to speak, and Ramsey helped her to her feet with surprising gentleness for such a large man. Nicole and Megan moved to support her, one on each side, and they walked her toward the small medical station that had been set up 50 yards away, staffed by hospital corpsman Second Ass Jake Merrick, who had been assigned to monitor for adverse reactions during the training. Crawford watched them go, his expression unreadable, and then turned back to the next group waiting to enter the chamber, calling out names and checking equipment with mechanical efficiency. Jake Merrick was 27, lean and competent, with the calm demeanor of someone who had seen enough medical emergencies to know the difference between serious and merely uncomfortable. He guided Cassidy to sit on the back of the medical truck, checked her vital signs, looked into her eyes with a pen light, and asked her questions designed to assess whether she needed further intervention. Her pulse was elevated, but not dangerously so. Her breathing was returning to normal, and her responses were coherent if shaky. He made notes in his log, marked her as having completed the training successfully despite the physical reaction, and then told her she could return to her division once she felt stable enough to do so. He noticed her hands while he was checking her pulse, noticed the scars that covered them, and something about those scars triggered a memory of a conversation he had overheard in the hospital corridors. Dr. Garrett talking to another physician about a patient with unusual burn patterns. He filed that observation away, uncertain what it meant, but instinctively recognizing it as significant. Nth rest of the training day proceeded with surreal normalcy, as if Cass's near breakdown in the confidence chamber had been a minor hiccup rather than a profound crisis. She moved through afternoon classes on nautical terminology and evening drills on firefighting procedures with the mechanical efficiency of someone running on autopilot. And by the time Division 352 was dismissed at night, she had rebuilt most of her emotional defenses, though they felt more fragile than before, as if they had been cracked and hastily glued back together. She ate dinner without tasting it, showered in the communal head without registering the temperature of the water, and fell into her rack, fully intending to sleep for the first time in days. But sleep remained elusive, and instead she lay in the darkness listening to the sound of the barracks, the snores and rustling and occasional whispered conversations. And she thought about how much longer she could maintain the charade of being a functional person when her mind remained trapped in a burning room that existed 5 years in the past. 3 days later, everything changed. Division 352 had been scheduled for battle stations, the culminating event of basic training. And the entire division was transported by bus to the USS Marlin Spike, which was not actually a ship, but a shore-based facility designed to look and function exactly like a naval vessel, complete with passageways and hatches and compartments, and all the equipment that sailors would encounter on deployment. The battle station's evolution was a 24-hour marathon of simulated emergencies, firefighting, damage control, security threats, and medical crises, designed to test everything the recruits had learned and to forge them into teams that could function under extreme stress. Crawford had been building up to this event for weeks, using it as a threat and a promise, telling the division that this was where their true capabilities would be revealed and where those who did not belong would finally be exposed. NTHE evolution began at 0600 with a simulated general quarters alarm, and the division scrambled to their assigned stations throughout the mock ship, donning firefighting gear and preparing for first scenario. Cassidy had been assigned to the damage control team for the engineering spaces, along with Nicole Megan Garrett Holmes and 5 other recruits under the supervision of Senior Chief Petty Officer Frank Carroll, a gruff 48-year-old engineer who had spent 26 years maintaining ships and had little patience for incompetence, but enormous respect for effort. The first few scenarios went smoothly. Simulated pipe ruptures that required isolation and repair, electrical fires that needed to be contained, flooding situations that demanded quick thinking and teamwork. Cassidy performed adequately, her technical knowledge evident in the speed with which she diagnosed problems and identified solutions. though her damaged hands made some of the physical tasks slower than they should have been. 6 hours into the evolution, fatigue was beginning to set in across the division, which was exactly the point of the exercise, to test performance. When people were tired and stressed and operating beyond their normal capacity, the scenario controllers, a team of experienced instructors who monitor the exercise and introduce complications, decided to escalate the difficulty level, and they triggered a cascading emergency that involved multiple simultaneous problems requiring coordination between different damage control teams. Cass's team was responding to a simulated fire in an electrical panel when the alarm klaxon sounded again, indicating a new emergency in an adjacent compartment. Senior Chief Carroll split the team, sending half to continue dealing with the electrical fire and taking the other half, including Cassidy and Garrett, to respond to the new problem. They entered the adjacent compartment, which was filled with theatrical smoke from generators designed to simulate fire conditions. And the scenario called for them to locate and rescue a simulated casualty while containing the supposed fire. The smoke was thick enough to reduce visibility to a few feet, and the compartment was hot from heaters that had been running to make the environment more realistic. Cassidy stepped through the hatch and immediately felt her psychological defenses begin to crumble. The smoke, the heat, the enclosed space. It was too much like the Fitzgerald, too much like the nightmare she had been trying to escape, and she felt panic rising in her throat like bile. She froze, her breathing accelerating, her mind beginning to slip away from the present moment and into the past. And she might have completely dissociated if not for what happened next. From deeper in the smoke-filled compartment came a sound that did not fit the scenario. A gasping, wheezing noise that was real rather than simulated. Garrett Holmes heard it too, and pushed past Cassidy toward the sound. And when he emerged from the smoke a moment later, he was supporting recruit Cody Crawford, Vincent Crawford's 19-year-old brother, who was bent double and struggling to breathe. Cody's face was gray, his lips tinged with blue, and each breath produced a high-pitched wheeze that indicated severe airway constriction. He was having an asthma attack, a real one, triggered by the smoke and the stress, and it was rapidly escalating toward a medical emergency. Garrett shouted for a corpsman, his voice cutting through the noise of the drill, and Senior Chief Carroll immediately recognized the situation had transitioned from training to crisis. He hit the emergency stop button that halted the exercise and activated the real emergency response protocols. And suddenly, the theatrical smoke began to clear as ventilation systems kicked in and medical personnel were summoned. MBUD Cody could not wait for the smoke to clear or for the corpsman to arrive from another part of the facility. His breathing was deteriorating by the second, each breath weaker than the last, and his eyes were starting to roll back in his head as oxygen deprivation began to affect his consciousness. Garrett was a trained firefighter, but had limited medical knowledge beyond basic first aid, and he looked around desperately for help, for someone who knew what to do. Cassidy stood 3 feet away, frozen, watching the scene unfold, and something in her mind clicked. This was not the Fitzgerald. This was not 5 years ago. This was now. And there was someone dying in front of her, and she had the knowledge to save him. The panic that had been paralyzing her transformed in an instant into crystal in focus. The same transformation that had occurred in the weapons bay when abstract terror had been replaced by concrete purpose. She moved forward with decisive speed, dropping to her knees beside Cody, her hands already moving to assess his condition. She checked his pulse, which was rapid and thready, and listened to his breathing, which had degraded to barely audible gasps. His inhaler, which should have been in his pocket as part of his medical gear, was not there, lost somewhere in the chaos of the drill. Cassidy looked up at Senior Chief Carlisle, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that seemed impossible, coming from a recruit who had been on the verge of panic moments before. He needs epinephrine now, not in 5 minutes when the corpsman gets here. Do you have an EpiPen in the medical kit? Carroll nodded and grabbed the trauma bag that was mounted on the wall, pulling out the auto-injector and handing it to her. Cassidy took it, checked the expiration date with a glance, positioned it against Cody's thigh, and administered the injection with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before. Though when her where or why were questions that registered on Carroll's face as he watched her work. Enthepe epinephrine took effect within seconds. Cody's airway beginning to relax, his breathing becoming deeper and more effective, color returning to his face. Cassidy positioned him in recovery position, monitored his pulse, kept talking to him in a low, calm voice that kept him anchored to consciousness while his body stabilized. When Jake Merrick and Hospital Corpsman Chief Linda Morrison arrived 90 seconds later with a full medical kit and a stretcher, they found Cody stable and Cassidy still kneeling beside him, her scarred hands resting on his shoulder, her face calm but her eyes haunted. Linda took one look at the scene, assessed what had happened, and gave Cassidy an appraising look that suggested she was filing away questions for later. They loaded Cody onto the stretcher and carried him out to a waiting ambulance that would transport him to the base hospital for observation, and the battle station's evolution was officially terminated. All teams recalled to the main assembly area for accountability and debriefing. And Vincent Crawford heard about his brother's medical emergency via radio while he was supervising a different team in another part of the facility, and he arrived at the scene just as the ambulance was pulling away. His face was ashen, fear for his brother wearing with the rigid control he maintained over his emotions, and he demanded details from Senior Chief Carroll about what had happened. Carroll explained the situation, including the part about Recruit Blake's intervention, and Crawford's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: shock, confusion, grudging gratitude, and finally, suspicion. He looked around for Cassidy, spotted her sitting on a bench near the entrance to the compartment where the incident had occurred, and walked over to her with deliberate steps. Nicole and Megan had positioned themselves near her, protective without being obvious about it, and they watched Crawford approach with weary eyes. And Crawford stopped directly in front of Cassidy and looked down at her, his jaw working as he struggled with what to say. Finally, he managed. "My brother could have died. You saved his life. I don't understand how a recruit with your level of training knew how to respond to a medical emergency like that, but I'm grateful you did." He paused, and his next words came with visible difficulty, as if they were being dragged out of him against his will. "Thank you." Cassidy nodded, accepting the thanks without comment, and Crawford turned and walked away toward his vehicle so he could drive to the hospital, leaving behind a division full of recruits who had just witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about Cassidy Blake and about Crawford himself. Admiral Thomas Kirkland had not planned to observe Division 352's battle station's evolution, but Captain Lawson had called in the previous evening to inform him of the accelerated schedule and to suggest that he might want to be present given his interest in the division's performance. He had arrived at the USS Marlinspike facility just as the medical emergency was unfolding, and he had watched through the observation windows as Cassidy administered the epinephrine and stabilized Cody Crawford. He had seen the transformation in her demeanor, the shift from paralyzed recruit to confident medical responder, and he had recognized in that transformation the evidence of training and experience that went far beyond basic first aid. He stood in the observation room long after the ambulance departed, staring at the now empty compartment, and he knew with absolute certainty that his suspicions about Cassidy Blake were correct, that she was not just the woman who had saved the Fitzgerald, but someone who possessed capabilities that had been forged through extensive training and multiple crucibles. NH made a decision. The time for protecting her anonymity had passed, not because he wanted to violate her privacy, but because the situation had evolved beyond the point where silence served anyone's interests. She had saved another life today, had demonstrated skills that made her fellow recruits, and even some of the instructors look incompetent by comparison, and the questions that would arise from that demonstration could not be answered without revealing at least some of her history. More importantly, she deserved recognition, not the kind of recognition that came with medals and ceremonies, which she had already rejected, but the kind of recognition that came with being seen and valued and protected by an institution that had previously failed her. He picked up his phone and called Captain Lawson, and when she answered, he spoke with the quiet certainty of a man who had made a difficult decision and would not be swayed from it. "Captain, I need you to assemble Division 352 and all available training staff in the base auditorium at 1,800 hours today. Full dress uniforms. This is not optional. I'm going to address them directly about Recruit, and I'm going to ensure that everyone understands exactly who she is and what she represents. It's time to stop hiding the truth." Lawson was silent for a moment, processing the implications, and then she responded with simple acknowledgement. "Yes, sir. I'll make the arrangements." She hung up, and immediately began the process of organizing what would become one of the most significant assemblies in the recent history of Naval Station Great Lakes. An event that would be remembered and discussed for years afterward, a moment when institutional failure was publicly acknowledged and a hidden hero was finally brought into the light. An NTH base auditorium was a cavernous space designed to hold 1,000 people with rows of hard plastic seats bolted to a sloped floor and a raised stage at the front that was typically used for graduation ceremonies. By 1730 hours, Division 352 had assembled in the first 10 rows, their dress whites pressed and perfect, their faces reflecting varying degrees of confusion and curiosity about why they had been summoned on such short notice. Behind them sat the training staff, instructors, and chief petty officers, and officers who normally would have been off duty at this hour, but who had been recalled by Captain Lawson's directive. The atmosphere carried the peculiar tension of an audience that knows something significant is about to happen, but cannot quite identify what form that significance will take. Whispered speculation moved through the ranks, like an electrical current. Theories about disciplinary actions or policy changes, or perhaps some kind of commendation for the division's performance during battle stations before the exercise had been terminated. Cassidy sat in the third row position between Nicole and Megan, and she felt as though she were watching events unfold from a great distance, as if her consciousness had detached from her body and was observing from somewhere near the ceiling. She had known from the moment Admiral Kirkland had appeared at the battle station's facility that this day was inevitable. You could not save someone's life in front of witnesses and expect to remain invisible. You could not demonstrate competence that exceeded your supposed training and expect people not to ask questions. The careful anonymity she had constructed over 5 years was about to be dismantled, and she found herself strangely calm about it. The kind of calm that comes when you've been dreading something for so long that its actual arrival feels almost like relief. Nicole kept glancing at her with worried eyes, having noticed the unnatural stillness that had settled over her friend. But Cassidy did not respond to the unspoken questions, simply sat with her hands folded in her lap, her scarred fingers interlaced, waiting for the hammer to fall. And Vincent Crawford sat in the instructor section, still wearing the uniform he had changed into after returning from the hospital, where Cody remained under observation, stable, but shaken. The doctors had told Vincent that his brother would make a full recovery, that the asthma attack had been severe, but the quick administration of epinephrine had prevented any lasting damage, and Vincent had felt an emotion so unfamiliar it had taken him several minutes to identify it as genuine gratitude. He had spent most of his adult life cultivating anger as a defense mechanism, using it to mask the grief and guilt he carried over his older brother Thomas's death from an opioid overdose 7 years ago. Thomas had been a specialist in the Army, had been prescribed pain medication after an injury, and had spiraled into addiction with a speed that terrified everyone who knew him. Vincent had tried to help, had staged interventions, and paid for rehab, and done everything he could think of. But in the end, he had watched his brother destroy himself, and the helplessness of that experience had calcified into a hard shell of rage that he directed at anyone he perceived as weak or vulnerable. Cody, his youngest brother, represented a second chance, an opportunity to protect someone before it was too late. And the realization that Cody had nearly died while under his supervision had cracked something in Vincent's carefully maintained armor. And Captain Rebecca Lawson entered through a side door and moved the podium on stage, her posture military perfect and her expression giving away nothing of the nerves she felt about what was about to occur. She had spent an hour that afternoon with Admiral Kirkland, reviewing the classified files he intended to reference and discussing how to frame the information in a way that would serve both truth and discretion. She understood that what they were about to do was irregular, that revealing classified information to a room full of junior personnel and instructors violated multiple protocols. But she also understood that sometimes the right thing to do and the regulation thing to do were not the same. And she had learned over 27 years in the Navy that leadership meant knowing when to follow the rules and when to trust your judgment over the manual. She stepped to the microphone, waited for the murmuring to die down, and spoke in the clear, authoritative voice that carried to every corner of the auditorium without needing amplification. Division 352 training staff, thank you for assembling on short notice. What I'm about to tell you is that we are honored tonight by the presence of Fleet Admiral Thomas Kirkland, who has requested the opportunity to address this division directly. The Admiral's remarks will reference classified information that is being declassified for the specific purpose by order of the Chief of Naval Operations. You are to treat what you hear tonight with the seriousness it deserves, and you are not to discuss the details outside of official channels. Admiral Kirkland. She stepped away from the podium, and Admiral Kirkland took her place, moving with the measured gait of someone who understood that every gesture carried meaning when you wore 4 stars on your shoulders. He was in service dress blues, his uniform immaculate, his ribbons and badges arranged in perfect order, and when he looked out at the assembled division, his expression was grave but not unkind. He did not begin with pleasantries or primals. Instead, he simply started speaking, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to reveal a truth that had been buried too long. 5 years ago, I was a commanding officer of the USS Fitzgerald, a guided missile destroyer home port in San Diego. On November 14th, during a routine live-fire exercise 90 miles off the coast, we experienced a catastrophic weapon system malfunction that started a fire in our vertical launch system bay. The fire spread rapidly, and within minutes we were facing a scenario where the heat would cause our entire missile complement to detonate. An explosion that would have destroyed the ship and killed everyone aboard. There were 340 people on that vessel. Sailors, officers, civilian contractors. All of them were my responsibility, and all of them were about to die because our automated safety systems had failed, and the manual override for the weapon system was located inside a compartment that was already fully engulfed in flames. Nth Auditorium had gone absolutely silent. The kind of silence that is not merely an absence of sound, but rather a presence in itself, a collective holding of breath as everyone present recognized they were hearing something profound. Kirkland continued, his hands gripping the edges of the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd, but not really seeing anyone, lost in the memory he was describing. The access to that override was through a ventilation shaft that was 18 in wide and 30 feet long. None of my sailors could fit through it wearing firefighting gear. And without that gear, entering that compartment was suicide. The temperature inside was over 300 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing. I was faced with an impossible choice. Order an abandoned ship and hope we could evacuate fast enough to survive the explosion, or find someone small enough to fit through that shaft and willing to crawl into a burning compartment, knowing they would likely die in the attempt. NH paused, letting the horror of that scenario settle into minds of his audience. And then he continued with his voice growing softer, but somehow more intense. We had a civilian defense contractor aboard, a young woman named Sarah Blake, who was serving as a technical consultant for the weapon system because she had helped design it. She was 23 years old, brilliant, dedicated to her work, and she volunteered to go. I ordered her not to. I told her it was too dangerous, that I could not allow a civilian to sacrifice herself for my crew. She looked at me and said, 340 people, Captain. I can save 340 people. And then she went before I could stop her. She crawled through that shaft with nothing but a wet towel over her face, reached the override panel, and operated it with her bare hands, even though the metal was hot enough to cause third-degree burns on contact. It took her 79 seconds to complete the task. 79 seconds of unimaginable pain, during which she saved every single life on that ship. And the audience was transfixed now, leaning forward in their seats, and several people had tears in their eyes as they processed the enormity of what they were hearing. Kirkland reached down and picked up a tablet that had been resting on the podium, and he tapped the screen several times, bringing up a classified file that Captain Lawson had transferred to the device earlier that afternoon. The Navy wanted to give her the Navy Cross. The Secretary of Defense wanted to give her the Defense Distinguished Service Medal. We wanted parades and recognition, and all the things we do to honor extraordinary heroism. She refused everything. She was suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, from survivor's guilt, even though she was the one who ensured there were no casualties, and from physical injuries that ended her career and changed her life permanently. She disappeared before we could complete the medal process. And despite extensive efforts to locate her for follow-up medical and psychiatric care, we were unable to find her. She vanished into obscurity, carrying her trauma alone, and for 5 years, I have wondered what happened to the woman who saved my life and the lives of my crew. He looked up from the tablet, and his gaze traveled across the audience until it found Cassidy sitting frozen in the third row with Nicole's hand gripping hers so tightly it hurt. Their eyes met, and in that moment, 1,000 unspoken communications passed between them. Apologies and gratitude and shared understanding of what trauma does to the human soul. Kirkland's voice, when he continued, was filled with an emotion that made several of the instructors in the back rows shift uncomfortably in their seats, and used to seeing such raw feeling from a flag officer. 3 days ago, I conducted an inspection of Division 352. I stopped in front of a recruit whose hands bore scars so distinctive that I recognized them immediately, because I had spent months looking at photographs of those injuries. Photographs that were part of the classified investigation into the Fitzgerald incident. I realized I was standing in front of Sarah Blake, who now goes by her legal first name, Cassidy, and who enlisted in the Navy 8 weeks ago trying to find purpose and structure in a life that had been destroyed by her act of heroism. A ripple of shock ran through the division, heads turning toward Cassidy, eyes wide with disbelief and sudden understanding. Brandon Whitfield felt as though he had been physically struck, his face draining of color as he realized that the woman he had mocked and dismissed as weak was responsible for one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in recent naval history. Marcus Delaney, sitting beside him, made a small wounded sound as the weight of his own cruelty crashed down on him. Garrett Holmes, who had supported Cassidy during the gas chamber, felt his eyes burn with tears because he understood exactly what it meant to carry that kind of trauma, to wake up every day with the ghosts of the people you saved and the piece of yourself you lost in the saving. Nicole squeezed Cassid's hand harder, and Megan reached across to place her other hand on Cassid's shoulder, creating a physical barrier of support against the stares and the shock. And Vincent Crawford sat as if he'd been turned to stone, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of the recruit he had tormented with the hero Admiral Kirkland was describing. The cognitive dissonance was so profound it was almost painful, like trying to hold two completely contradictory truths in his head simultaneously and having them both be real. This was the woman he had called weak, the woman he had publicly humiliated, the woman whose hands he had mocked as damaged and useless. And she had saved his brother's life that morning with those same hands, had responded to a medical emergency with a competence that spoke of extensive training. And before that, she had saved 340 people, including a future admiral, by enduring pain that Crawford could not even begin to imagine. He felt his carefully constructed worldview crumbling, felt the foundations of his identity as a hard man who could identify weakness being revealed as nothing more than prejudice and cruelty disguised as professional assessment. And Admiral Kirkland was not finished. He tapped the tablet again, and a large screen behind him illuminated with an image of a classified personnel file heavily redacted but with certain key information visible. After the Fitzgerald incident, Sarah Blake underwent 32 surgeries over 18 months. The medical team recommended amputation of both hands due to the severity of the tissue damage, but she refused and instead endured reconstructive procedures that saved partial functionality. Her hands retain approximately 60% of normal grip strength, reduced fine motor control, chronic pain, and permanent nerve damage. She was diagnosed with severe PTSD, major depressive disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder. She received a psychiatric prognosis of poor, without intensive long-term intervention. Her defense contractor employer kept her on payroll during her recovery, but eventually terminated her employment when it became clear she could no longer perform the technical work that had been her specialty. She went through her savings, went through her severance, and eventually found herself in a financial and psychological crisis that led her to enlist in the Navy, seeking the structure and purpose that civilian life could no longer provide. The screen changed to show medical photographs of Cassid's hands immediately after the incident, and there was an audible gasp from the audience at the horror of the injuries. The images showed hands that barely looked human, covered in blisters and charred tissue and raw wounds that were difficult to look at even in photograph form. Kirkland let the images remain visible for several seconds, ensuring that everyone present understood the physical cost of what Cassidy had done. And then he advanced to another slide that showed her hands as they appeared after the reconstructive surgery, still heavily scarred but recognizably functional. These hands, he said, his voice harder now, carrying an edge of anger that was directed not at anyone present, but at the universe's injustice. Save more lives in 79 seconds than most people will save in their entire careers. And the woman who owns him has spent 8 weeks being harassed, mocked, and told she is inadequate by people who do not possess one-tenth of her courage or competence. Empty accusation hung in the air like smoke, and several instructors who had participated in or witnessed Cass's mistreatment found themselves unable to meet the Admiral's eyes. Ryan Hutchkins, Crawford's assistant, felt his stomach twist with shame at the memory of the times he had laughed at Crawford's jokes about Blake's hands, the times he had remained silent when he should have intervened. Lieutenant Andrew Kirkland, the Admiral's son, who had observed some of Division 352's training evolution and had not questioned the instructor's methods, felt a profound sense of failure at his own blindness. Captain Lawson, standing to the side of the stage, maintained her composure, but internally cataloged the systematic failures of oversight and leadership that had allowed institutional cruelty to flourish unchecked. Admiral Kirkland closed the file on his tablet and set the device down, then gripped the podium again and leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a lower register that somehow carried even more authority than his previous volume. I am not here tonight to humiliate anyone or to seek punishment for past actions. I am here to ensure that going forward, every person in this room understands what real strength looks like. Real strength is not measured in physical size or loud voices or the ability to dominate others. Real strength is measured in the willingness to sacrifice yourself for people you barely know. It is measured in the ability to endure unbearable pain in service of a mission. It is measured in getting up every morning and facing another day when every fiber of your being wants to give up. Recruit Blake has demonstrated more real strength in her short time at this base than most of you will demonstrate in your entire careers, and she has done it while carrying injuries and trauma that would have broken most people years ago. NH paused, scanning the audience, letting his words sink into the consciousness of everyone present, and then he delivered the final piece of information that would fundamentally alter how everyone viewed the events of the morning. This morning, during the battle station's evolution, Recruit Blake saved the life of Recruit Cody Crawford when he experienced a severe asthma attack. She administered emergency epinephrine and stabilized him until medical personnel arrived. Her response time was perfect. Her technique was flawless, and her decision-making was exactly what you would expect from someone with extensive medical training. What you might not know is that after the Fitzgerald incident, while she was recovering from her injuries, she completed an intensive combat medical responder course because she never wanted to be in a situation where she watched someone die because she lacked the knowledge to save them. She was already a hero when she took that course, already disabled, already traumatized, and she still pushed herself to acquire skills that might help her protect others. That is who Cassidy Blake is. That is what she represents. And if any of you ever again question her place in this Navy, you will answer to me personally. The threat was delivered calmly without raised voice or dramatic emphasis, but it carried absolute conviction, and every person in the auditorium understood that the Admiral meant exactly what he said. He stepped back from the podium and then did something that sent shock waves through the assembled personnel. He came to attention, brought his right hand up in the sharpest, most precise salute of his 4-decade career, and held it there, his eyes fixed on Cassidy Blake in the third row. It was the same gesture he had begun 5 years ago in the Combat Information Center of the Fitzgerald, when medics were carrying her out on a stretcher. The salute he had never gotten to complete, because she had been unconscious, and he had been overwhelmed with the chaos of saving his ship. Now he completed it holding the position for a full 5 seconds while the auditorium remained frozen in stunned silence, and then he dropped his hand and spoke one final sentence. "Recruit Blake, would you please come to the stage?" And Cassidy did not want to move. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to remain in her seat, to make herself small and invisible, to resist this public exposure that violated everything she had been trying to achieve by enlisting anonymously. But Nicole's hand on hers and Megan's hand on her shoulder provided just enough support to get her to her feet. And once standing, muscle memory took over. Her body executing the commands her mind was too overwhelmed to consciously direct. She walked down the road to the aisle, her steps measured, and even despite the trembling in her legs. And then she climbed the stairs to the stage with Captain Lawson watching from the side and Admiral Kirkland waiting at the center. The walk felt endless. every eye in the auditorium tracking her movement. And when she finally reached the Admiral, she came to attention automatically, her training overriding her emotional state. Nurkland did not salute again. Instead, he extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Cassidy took it, feeling the firm, warm grip that communicated respect and gratitude and apology all at once. He held her hand for several seconds, and when he spoke, his voice was pitched for her ears only, though the microphone picked it up enough that the people in the first few rows could hear. I am sorry we failed you. I am sorry the system that should have supported you instead abandoned you. I am sorry you felt you had to hide who you are in order to serve. And I am grateful, more grateful than I have words to express that you are alive and that you are here. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for saving my crew. Thank you for continuing to serve despite everything you have endured. And Cassidy's response was barely a whisper, her voice rough with suppressed emotion. I didn't do it for gratitude. Sir, I did it because it was the right thing to do. Kirkland smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face from stern authority to human warmth. I know that's what makes it heroism instead of duty. Duty is doing what you're told. Heroism is doing what's right even when no one is telling you to do it. He released her hand and turned to face the auditorium again. And this time when he spoke, his voice carried command authority that demanded obedience. Division 352 on your feet. The division scrambled to attention, the sound of 93 people standing simultaneously echoing in the space. Training staff on your feet. The instructors and officers in the back rows stood as well, coming to attention with varying degrees of awareness about what was about to happen. I want everyone in this room to render honors to Recruit Blake. This is not a formal military honor ceremony because she has previously declined official recognition, but this is a personal acknowledgement from every person who now knows her story. You will salute, and you will hold that salute until I give the order to drop. This is not optional. This is not symbolic. This is a debt of respect that we owe to someone who sacrificed more than any of us have been asked to sacrifice. The Admiral came to attention himself and raised his hand in salute once more. And after a fractional delay, every person in the auditorium followed suit. 150 people saluting a single recruit who stood on stage looking overwhelmed and frightened and desperately uncomfortable with the attention. The moment stretched 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. And in that extended silence, something fundamental shifted in the consciousness of everyone present. They were not just saluting a person. They were saluting an idea. The idea that heroism exists in unexpected places, that courage comes in forms they had not been trained to recognize, that their assumptions about strength and weakness had been catastrophically wrong. Admiral Kirkland finally dropped a salute, and the rest of the auditorium followed, hands snapping down in unison. "Dism," he said, and the assembly was over, except it was not really over because the ripples from what had just occurred would spread outward for years to come. Cassidy remained on the stage for a moment, uncertain what to do. And then Captain Lawson approached and quietly told her that she could return to her division, that there would be no immediate changes to her training schedule, that life would proceed as normal, except that now everyone knew. Cassidy walked back down the stage stairs and up the aisle toward the exit. And as she passed the crowd of people who were slowly filing out, she saw their faces. Some showing shame, some showing admiration, some showing confusion, but all showing new awareness that she was not what they had assumed. And Vincent Crawford waited near the exit, having positioned himself there deliberately. And when Cassidy approached, he stepped slightly into her path, not blocking her, but making it clear he wanted to speak. She stopped, looking up at him with weary eyes. And for a long moment, they simply stood there while people flowed around them toward the doors. Crawford struggled with words, his throat working, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Finally, he managed to speak, and his voice was Ursero with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in years. "I was wrong about you, completely fundamentally wrong. I saw your scars, and I made assumptions about